Alright, I am back, not with another Destiny 2 video, but with something that is Destiny 2 adjacent. I am of course talking about the news that Naughty Dog announced that they are canceling the Last of Us factions completely, which they call The Last of Us Online. I swear they called it factions before, but nevertheless, it is completely canceled. This is shocking but not surprising, where it's kind of shocking that they would put all of this time and money into something that is never going to see the light of day. Yet it is not surprising given the context of what this has been like, where after all of these years, we have one piece of concept art for this, which I know you've seen. It's the one piece that everyone always shares that is probably going to be the thumbnail for this video, because what the hell else am I going to use? And recent news has just been bad. So we have I'll talk about this more later, but Bungie reviewed it as part of their live service consultation. They said it wasn't up to par or engaging enough or something like that. Then shortly after, there were people taken off the game. And then, well, we still heard that people were working on it. Neil Druckmann was asked about it, and he's like, we have nothing to report about Last of Us properties at this time. And I'm like, well, that doesn't sound good. And sure enough, they have canceled the game, and the way they canceled the game is pretty significant, because they released this post, and they laid out essentially what their choices were. And what they discovered is that if they kept going on this and needed to support it as a live service game into the future, which they were supposed to, it would take the entire studio to do that. And that may sound crazy, but Naughty Dog, it's big, but it's not that big. It's like 400 something people. So yes, it is easy to imagine to support a live service game indefinitely into the future, you would need almost all of those people. And so the choice is between doing that and turning the studio into a live service studio, or just going back and making more single player games. Like The Last of Us Part 2, which, though controversial perhaps, is the most critically awarded game in history. Literally, you can go and see how many awards it won, and nothing else is really close. And then, of course, they have the acclaimed Uncharted series. They have Last of Us Part 1. And they are making some sort of space game, and maybe The Last of Us Part 3. And, of course, The Last of Us spawned a TV series that has just been nominated for 24 Emmys. So, to take this studio and morph them into some sort of live service, seasonal battle pass making, thing is a terrible idea. So ultimately Sony and they decided not to do this. And this sort of plays into this whole talk about the live service bubble bursting, which I have spoken of many times. And this really is bad for Sony, and is the latest thing that's happened where their live service ambitions seem like they're falling apart before they've even gotten started. So to recap this, Sony obviously makes a lot of great single-player games. They sell really well. They are nominated for lots of awards usually. Spider-Man's 0 for 7 losses aside. But Sony wants to get in on the games as service part of the industry, because those can print money indefinitely, as opposed to selling a $70 game and being done with it. So that led them to announce that they were investing even more into the gaming division, and then ultimately 60% of their budget would be devoted toward live service games. And this would be a dozen games over the course of the next few years. And some of these we know about, like some of these already exist, like Sony bought Destiny 2. We know Destiny's making Marathon and another incubated game. We knew Naughty Dog was making Factions. There's a Horizon themed multiplayer game coming out. There's a bunch of these. But then, in addition to Jim Ryan and a couple of other people leaving, some people believe that this is tied together, this live service push, which is not panning out, they delayed 6 of those games indefinitely. Some of them may be dead, and said that there would instead be 6 games in the next few years instead. I think by 2025, maybe. And that may be down to 5, because that was announced a little while ago, and at that point, Factions was not canceled, and I'm sure they wanted to get it out before 2025. And then this led into the whole Factions drama. And Sony bought Bungie for $3.6 billion about a year and a half ago for two reasons. First, they thought that Bungie could just sort of print money for them as a live service or as a studio with a successful live service game and with probably a few more successful live service games on the horizon. And then secondly, they thought that Sony could advise their single player studios on how to make live service games. Neither of these things have panned out. First of all, obviously, I've talked many times about how Destiny is struggling. This year alone, granted, this may not have been able to be predicted at this level, but Lightfall was a disaster, which led to this big revenue miss, which has led to layoffs, which has led to questions about if they will, if Destiny survives, if Bungie survives, if Marathon will make it out, all of this stuff. Second, the idea that Bungie could consult and mold all these different studios into making successful live service games, that was always a reach. I am sure Bungie has very good advice to give, but there is a difference between giving good advice and actually having Bungie people work on these things and using their actual experience to do it. And I've said many times, we have seen such high profile examples of single player studios attempting to make live service multiplayer games and it just going terribly. And what almost always happens in these situations is they go right back to the thing they were making in the first place. So we have BioWare, which made Anthem. That failed. They went back to Mass Effect. We have Crystal Dynamics, which made Avengers. That failed. They're back to Tomb Raider unless Embracer kills them. We have, what is it? Not Take-Two. Who makes Borderlands? Gearbox. Duh. I won't cut that out. Gearbox, who makes Borderlands, they did Battleborn, and then that failed. They went back to Borderlands. And then we have Arcane, who made Redfall, and that failed. And now they're making a Blade game, which is not Dishonored, but it's single player. It's the same thing. And then we have an upcoming case of Rocksteady, who made Arkham, which is making Suicide Squad, a live service co-op multiplayer game, which I've actually heard is kind of good from the alpha test, but, that would be an exception if that did actually turn out to be true. So Naughty Dog was on the exact same path. They did Uncharted, Last of Us, all these great single-player games, and this was a multiplayer, version of The Last of Us, granted, but it was a live service, games as service, microtransaction, battle-paced seasonal thing, and they skipped the step of releasing the game and tried to make it work for a year or two, and then it failing, and then them going back to doing what they're doing. So it's good that they, this decision is a good decision, but it was a bad decision in the first place to greenlight this and to take it as far as it has. They said this has been in development since the production of The Last of Us Part 2. The Last of Us Part 2 started production in 2014. So this is 5, 6, 7 years of pre-production and development on this, and think of how much time has been lost and how much money and how many man hours have been lost making this as opposed to just investing in Naughty Dog's next single player thing. And when people heard that there was going to be factions, that was great. All anyone wanted was a sequel to The Last of Us Factions in the first game, which was a pretty good attached multiplayer mode. And so the idea that they could do that again made total sense. Obviously, they did it once, they could do Factions again. Factions 2, sounds great. The problem became when leadership decided, or Sony told them to make this into a big live service thing that would have to have content that is constantly updated and supported indefinitely. It's no longer good enough to just make a side multiplayer mode for funsies attached to your game. And that, is something that takes an enormous amount of investment to do, including, yes, an entire 400-person studio, most likely, if you really want to support it long term. As evidenced by Bungie, Destiny takes, up until recently, they've been incubating stuff. It's 900 people, 1,000 people to maintain Destiny. Even if that's, larger in the sense of PvE content, it is a full-time thing. And what I keep seeing is no one is really recognizing the types of games that do succeed in the genre. There are many failures of all types, but the ones that we've seen succeed is these long-term multiplayer games are either kind of sporadic success stories that you can't repeat. Fortnite was spawned out of a building game that just decided to copy the rising battle royale trend. Or you have studios that are well established with multiplayer and have been doing multiplayer to some extent for a long time. We have Call of Duty, obviously, which has done Warzone. That was a pretty logical transition for them. We have Apex Legends, which was made by Respawn, which previously did, obviously, Titanfall, but before that, they were formed by a lot of Call of Duty developers. And then even Bungie with Destiny. They, while they weren't doing live PvE content, they had years and years and years of Halo multiplayer experience to get that part of the game online. And we just have not almost ever seen a really successful single player developer try to pivot into live service and have it pan out. The highest profile example of this I can think of is GTA Online, where that started out as like whatever, but then Rockstar built it into this giant billion-dollar printing machine. But this is Rockstar, and they have billions of dollars to spend infinite amount of time trying to make that work. Whereas none of these other places have that luxury. And even Rockstar, they tried to do the same thing with Red Dead Online, and how did that go? Not great. So they're only really 1 for 2 in that realm. And all of this seems like it's falling apart for Sony before it even starts. And I get why Sony is trying to do this, because it's true. AAA game budgets are going insane. It costs an enormous amount of money to make the kind of games that they're known for making. And again, you are just relying on $70 sales on one platform for these games, which is why you've started to see them be a little bit more open about PC things, but generally speaking, that's the way it is. And you're lucky if you sell a $20, $30 expansion. Almost all of their big-time single-player games do not have microtransactions, which is great, which is part of the reason people love them so much. And they even do the God of War Valhalla DLC. I was going to do a whole video on that, but it's insane. It's something they easily could have charged $20, $30 for. It's an incredible piece of content, and it's free, which is awesome for us. But it shows that maybe they don't really value their single-player stuff as much as they should be doing. So they're chasing after that live service money. But their strategy for doing that has not been anything close to coherent. Buying Bungie, assuming that their live service stuff could just work indefinitely, was not a good decision. Assuming Bungie could just teach all these existing single player studios how to do live service stuff, and then not realizing that huge chunks, if not entire studios, would have to be devoted to not just building but maintaining these live service games. So we could talk about Guerrilla Games, and their Horizon ambitions, but is the same thing going to happen? Is Guerrilla just going to have to transition to be a live service studio as opposed to continuing to make single player games? And Horizon is a really good series, but is it, The Last of Us good? I don't know. And so Sony could just sacrifice them completely and be like, hey, you're making a Horizon Battle Royale or an MMORPG or whatever they're trying to make now. What is clear is that this is really going poorly. They have nothing to show for this. They have top executives that have left. Maybe it's unrelated. I would be shocked if it was totally unrelated. They have delayed half of their promised live service games. Bungie is in big trouble. And then their most high-profile in-house live service game, Factions, has been canceled after years and years and years of development. Some part of me is just could they pull an Overwatch? Could they salvage any of this and just do Factions 2 and release Factions 2 for $20 and just attach it to The Last of Us? It's just here's the multiplayer stuff we were doing, here's the arenas, here whatever. We're just not going to make a live service. I don't know. That's probably a pipe dream, and that's probably not how it works. But I feel like they should have something to show for all these years of development, and just to burn it all down is very sad. I don't see this getting better. It is hard for me to see, the things that they have on their plate and imagining there's going to be some massive breakout live service hit for Sony. Granted, it is hard to predict these things. Most of the biggest live service things you would never predict it. Remember Apex Legends launched out of nowhere with no campaign, and it was just alive one day. So you can't necessarily predict all this stuff. But if history has taught us anything, trying to force single player developers, even great single player developers, to suddenly switch to co-op live service endless content games does not go well in almost all cases. And what they end up doing is failing and going right back to what they're doing in the first place, except you have lost years and years of time and money trying to get them to do this. So I get Sony's in a tough spot. I think they're starting to be squeezed, being so limited to the PlayStation user base, being limited to $70 productions when there are many games that are just printing money forever. And like, I get that you want that, but that is not just something you snap your fingers or buy a studio and, can do. It is clearly much, much harder than that. And it is harder in a way that I don't think people understand, because to get players into a live service game is a much bigger ask than getting them to buy, a new sequel to whatever, Spider-Man 2, Last of Us 3, whatever. Because those games, you play them, you beat them in 20 hours, 30 hours, 50 hours, at the most, and people move on. A live service game, you are asking people to commit to, not just to get good at it, but to grind out the battle passes, to keep up with the live content. And nobody has room in their life for like more than 1 to 2 of those, and many of those are already, established. People are set in their ways with what they play. So every time you introduce a new one, it is an enormous ask to get people to convert over to it and start, playing it. Even something that feels really promising, like the finals, that's great gameplay. I think that has a lot of potential. Like, even that is not exactly like caught fire, and we're already seeing declining player counts. It's not really taking off on Steam. It is hard or you're taking off on Twitch. It is hard to get people into new things that aren't just like outrageously awesome. Like, I believe like Naughty Dog probably could have made a completely competent, multiplayer game, even a pretty good one, but you would have to just incredibly stand out in a very crowded field and convince people to drop other existing live service games to play yours, because you wouldn't have time otherwise. And that is something that is a much bigger ask than just normal game development and release. I do not think this is going to improve for Sony. I obviously personally hope that Bungie specifically recovers and gets a handle on things. I think Marathon is probably one of the most promising projects Sony has going in terms of live service stuff, though that might not be saying much given how low the bar is. And that is also a multi-platform game, so that wouldn't even really be a Sony exclusive game. It's just Sony makes the, a cut of it more than they would otherwise. So we'll see. I knew this was going to happen like for a while now. Like, it seemed pretty clear for a couple of years that if you're not showing anything at all from your game and not really even giving updates for it, things are not going great. And you can blame Bungie for seeing the game and saying it's bad, but like, this is a much larger picture than just that. And I think it is a good decision to just scrap this and call it a day, as opposed to doing the Anthem launch and flounder around for 2 years before moving on. Again, it would be nice if something could be salvaged with this for just some fun little multiplayer mode, but again, not gonna count on that. It's not a great situation. I feel bad for all the people that worked on this. I can't imagine working for years on something and then just having it be killed and it never being released. And like, even if you were paid for your time, still sucks. That's still probably one of the worst feelings you can have in game development. So be kind. Don't go all fanboy and gloat over this if you're an Xbox person. Like, it sucks. It just sucks. And unfortunately, it seemed very apparent that we were heading down this way. And I hope we don't have to see this again with other projects. And like, not saying Sony should cancel every single live service project they have going on, but like, they really, really got to look at this and figure out like, okay, what the hell are we doing? Like, how can we avoid this happening again? Like, who should be making what type of games? How much will we be investing here? It's a complicated problem, but one I think Sony approached terribly, and only recently do I think they're really starting to understand that. All right, so anyway, thanks for watching, and I will talk to you soon. Take care.